your mission to make scientific knowledge available to everyone is extraordinarily important. What I'm going to talk about is something slightly different, but relevant to that, which is how we take the benefits of that scientific knowledge and make that available. And I'm going to do that talking about vaccines, which of course are one of the most powerful scientific interventions, I would say, in history. So I think, that we start off with the question is, if they're so important, and just to give you an economic point of view, for every dollar you invest in vaccines, you get a $21 return. But if you take into account the indirect effects, that goes to $54 for every dollar invested. This seems like a no-brainer. But of course, the issue, like every challenge we have, is it isn't as simple as that. So what's blocking it to get being available equity? Is it vaccines? Is it the science? Is it the cost? Is it the mechanisms, distribution systems? I'm going to take you through a little quick movement to talk about what those are and how we have solved those. So the organization that I run, Gavi, was created to increase access, but let's go back to why that is. So in 1974, there were 6 vaccines at that point that were being used around the world regularly, but in developing countries, there was less than 5% coverage. And I have to say that, the UN system set up a program to work on immunization, and it slowly began to work. And you see this amazing tipping point in 1980. This relates actually to a leader from UNICEF, Jim Grant, who became a messianic leader for vaccination, carried around in his pockets vaccines and also oral rehydration salts and others. And he tried to get to universal childhood immunization, which was described as 80%. And he worked with political leaders and really succeeded in doing that. Well, what happened is his successor, he actually died a little bit after, said, well, he did that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else. And it dropped. And then there was a new initiative set up, and this initiative was going to take science and harness it and work with industry. And what happened is public sector couldn't work with private sector, and the whole thing blew up. So that's where we were. Bill Gates actually read the World Development Report, which I was an author of, and said, my God, this is like software. Once it's expensive to make, but once you can make it, you can distribute it. Why don't we do something about it? And so in the year 2000, Gavi was born, and it was a completely novel effort here. There are a number of groups that just phased by, but the issue is that it's an alliance. It's not an organization. So we bring together WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, private sector, drug companies, all to work together on trying to solve this problem. And as you can see, that continued the drive up of vaccines. We got to 81% coverage with a lot more vaccines, which we'll talk about. I do want to point out this drop here. That's obviously COVID. We'll talk about that and what the implications are. But to say this has been successful, it has. If you look at this, this is now the movement of vaccines forward. You can see that we're now over 1 billion unique children that have been vaccinated, and 65 million children get vaccinated a day, a year. That is now vaccines for more than half of the world's children on an annual basis. So this is really a very successful movement towards equity. Now, of course, you can say, well, you get vaccines out, so what? Well, the so what are really the indices. So we've seen a 70% reduction in vaccine-preventable diseases during this period, and that has contributed to a 50% reduction in child mortality, which is probably the most important indicator of development. So this is really an extraordinary effect on the planet in terms of this reduction to child mortality. We're not done yet, and we'll come back to that. But how do we work? So first of all, we bring new vaccines because there are powerful new vaccines, and this is why Gavi was started. But we also need to have a level of sustainability, because if we don't do that, then it's going to be a one-time doing it. We also have to shape the markets because new products are expensive. when they first come out. And finally, vaccines don't deliver themselves, so we need to create resilient health systems that are able to deliver these products. So if we look at the products over time, what you see here is an increase in the number of vaccines over time. A lot of interesting vaccines in here, 2 cancer vaccines, many important vaccines for epidemics that are out there, diseases that now, for the first time, we now have a malaria vaccine that we're in the midst of trying to roll out. And so we're seeing the progress of science move forward. And our goal, of course, it used to be that it was 15 or 20 years before a vaccine would be produced, available in the West, and when it would be available in developing countries. Now we do often simultaneous launches of vaccines, which is what we want to get to. So far, we've had 746 launches of new products across the developing world. Now, I want to give an example of a really interesting finding here. Throughout history, the thing that killed men was wars, and the thing that killed women was childbirth. If we had a vaccine against childbirth deaths, of course, we would have wanted to roll it out. We don't. But we do have a vaccine against cervical cancer. And today, you can see this extraordinary situation where we have more deaths of women from cervical cancer in the world than women who are dying in childbirth. So that's a great progress on childbirth, but we have a very effective vaccine that can be used, and this is a real priority. We initially had very low volumes of this vaccine, but now numbers of manufacturers are expanding, and we have a goal by 2025 to vaccinate 86 million girls to try to bend this curve and bring it down, and eventually it should get down to almost nothing. Now, how do we do this? How do we do sustainability? So when you're a very poor country, you start off paying almost nothing. And you might say, well, why should they pay anything? Well, the issue here is to get the Minister of Health to talk to the Minister of Finance and to create a line item for vaccines. So here we're at 20 cents a dose, very small amount. But once they have that line item and they use it year after year after year as they begin to get wealthier, they then get in the habit of paying, which is very important. They pass a certain economic threshold, and then they go into a preparatory transition. They increase 15% a year, and then they move into accelerated transition when they get richer until they actually finish Gavi funding. And the idea is to give the countries chances to be able to pay for their own vaccines. But as importantly, we have to drive the price down, and that becomes critical because these vaccines, given that they're expensive initially, are not going to be able to be afforded unless we're able to do that. Finally, when the country graduates from our support and they have to pay for the vaccines, we have a period of time we've negotiated with manufacturers to say, look, please don't raise the prices during this period because it's always going to be a fragile movement to paying for it yourself. And if you raise the prices, countries may not be able to afford it. We've recently worked with other middle-income countries that aren't part of Gavi to try to help them as well get access to prices because pricing is a problem for many different countries. Now, what do that price differentials look like? There are 11 vaccines that WHO recommends, listed here on the left, and those vaccines aren't exactly the same as we use in the West. For example, we use acellular pertussis. In the developing world, we use wholesale, and in the West, they use acellular. But you can see here the cost for the public sector for those 11 vaccines equivalent, about $1,300. We're down to $24 to $28. So this is a 98% reduction in price. This what allows countries to be able to afford that. The reason there is a range here is because HPV has just been shown through scientific studies that it may be effective enough as a single dose. And so even though the original studies were done with 3 doses and then changed to 2 doses, companies aren't crazy about this idea, but WHO has said each country can look at the data and we'll give a recommendation that is up to the country to make a decision on. And if you go to a single dose, obviously it makes it much easier to use going forward. To do this, we had to shift completely the mindset of manufacturers. And so when we started, there were 5 manufacturers. The majority were in wealthy countries. And if you look at the shift over time, today we have 19 manufacturers from 12 different countries, the majority of which are in developing countries. So this mechanism of creating a marketplace that would make sense for going from low-volume, high-cost products to high-volume, low-cost products turned out to be not only important for what we do, but also light bulbs went off in pharmaceutical companies because all of a sudden they're making more money in their primary markets because they're doing very large volumes and the costs are coming down. They're making money in middle-income markets and even a little in the Gavi markets. And so this becomes a very good economic model for them. Now, I said at the beginning to look at that little downshift. We did have, during COVID, during 2020, a 30 to 40% reduction in vaccine usage in developing countries during lockdown, as you might expect. At the end of 2020, remarkably, those numbers had come up and it ended up being about a 4% reduction. We thought that those numbers would keep going up, but then we had Omicron, Delta, and so during 2021, numbers went up and down. We saw another 1% reduction in the vaccine coverage. This is terrible. It's gone back 30 years. The slide here is actually something on 0 dose. This is the most important indicator for us. These are the children, communities that haven't received even a single dose of routine vaccines. We've been bringing that number down. It was about 9.3 million here. That rose up to 12.5 million. These are particularly important because these children, 2/3 live below the poverty line, and 50% of child mortality is occurring in these communities. So if you can reach these children, these families, you can reduce child mortality, again, dramatically. So that's what happened. But, you know, it's interesting. If you had said to me, Seth, take an educated guess, a new disease is going to occur, it's going to shut the entire world down, and people aren't going to be able to go out, and then we're going to vaccinate everybody in the world. We're going to vaccinate old people and adults and healthcare workers and sick people. What's going to happen to routine immunization? I probably would have said, I don't know, 30, 40, 50% reduction. It was 5%, which is very meaningful. But let me just show you how amazing health systems were. So in 2000, they delivered about 352 million doses of vaccines. By 2020, because of all the new vaccines I showed you, about 1 billion doses annually. In 2021, they delivered over 3 billion doses of vaccine, and yet only had that reduction. So I think what we have shown is that countries have built resilient health systems. And this is going to be critical. We need them to be better for the future, for the next inevitable outbreak that's going to be there. But this is how we're going to deal with that. So the other thing about Gavi is because we're a public-private partnership, because we don't have restrictions, we can innovate. And innovation is absolutely critical to what we do. I just want to give you a few examples. On the left here, you see a solar fridge. But one of the things we've done over the last, before COVID, was to bring 66,000 new cold chain fridges to countries. And most of those are solar, but they're using all kinds of nanotechnology and ice lines so that they are appropriate technology for the place. And of course, when COVID came, we had to build on top of it because we had all of a sudden mRNA vaccines that were minus 80 degrees, so we needed ultra cold chain, but we had a system in place that was there. We have all kinds of innovations around vaccines and around vial markers to show when they might have been exposed to hot temperatures. Digital is critical, how to track and trace, how to follow, how to have a system in place for that. Logistics, first commercial use of drones to deliver. It started out, it was going to be snakebite venom and rabies because those are vaccines you can't and materials you can't have everywhere. It ended up being used as the killer case initially for blood. Rwanda set up a blood bank where anytime you needed blood, you just texted, and at 20 minutes your blood came. If you needed more, you texted, it came again, and that could be any different type of blood, but also any product. changed everything. Now that's being used across many different countries for delivering vaccines, but other technologies as well. And then finally, on the innovative financing area, this has really been critical because people think of science innovation or technical innovation, but we have all kinds of interesting instruments that we use to be able to make sure vaccines are available, that the finance is available, and including even when Ebola occurred, there was no market for this vaccine. So we created an artificial market that allowed the manufacturers to have confidence to be able to produce it, and now there's a stockpile that is readily available. Speaking of stockpiles, we have many of them now, but in this era of climate change we've been talking about for the last 2 days, the effects of climate change are having an effect on outbreaks. And here's just a really interesting slide, and two aspects of it are interesting to me. One is, you notice there's very little interest here in cholera vaccines, because the first really good vaccines kind of came here. The reason is, in the old days, no country wanted to admit it they had cholera. They said, we have some type of acute diarrhea or something like that, because it was stigmatizing. But as soon as they began to realize that there was a cholera vaccine that could stop those, all of a sudden countries began to admit they had cholera, which was great. What we've seen, though, of course, is that with climate change, the numbers are going up dramatically, and we're actually right now at the limits of supply, trying to bring more manufacturers in, but our goal ultimately is to try to get rid of cholera. So if you're a new manufacturer, maybe this isn't where you want to come into for the longer term, but these are the types of challenges we're doing. Now, I want to finish talking a little bit about COVAX and COVID vaccines, because I know that's of interest to everyone. And I want to start with why we did this. So right in January of 2020, my wife, who's sitting there, and Richard Hatchett, who runs another global organization, and myself, sat there with President Trump down the street saying, there's not going to be a problem, it's all going to be over by Easter. And we said, what happened in the past? And what's interesting is, in the previous pandemic, swine flu, there were no vaccines that got to developing countries because they all got hoarded by wealthy countries. So we knew that was going to happen. So I know many people have said, well, we're naive, but we said, regardless of that, we're going to have to try to do it. So what we did is we set up COVAX, and it was extraordinary, the interest of COVAX. We ended up, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon talked about the Paris Climate Accord. We had the second largest number of countries come together. In this case, the US wasn't with us, Russia wasn't with us, just a couple, but 193 countries came together to try to push this. And I think this was an example of what interest there was in trying to do it. Some of the extraordinary things that happened, you've already heard about the magic of the science. 327 days from the genome being published to the first vaccine being used outside of a clinical trial, an incredible story. Our first vaccine was given 39 days after the first vaccine given outside of a clinical trial in the UK. And we were on the path to do hundreds and hundreds, and then hundreds and hundreds of millions, I should have said, and then billions. And then we saw the worst, the underbelly of the world. We saw vaccine nationalism, we saw export bans, we saw all kinds of bad behavior from political leaders and companies, but we pushed along. And where are we today? We actually have 55% coverage of primary vaccine in the 92 poorest countries in the world. That's the bottom half of the world, as compared to 66% globally. So still not equitable, but in fact, the wealthy populations, of course, have a lot more elderly people and a lot more immunosuppressed people, et cetera. So we've come really far, and we delivered 1.95 billion doses as part of our effort to do this from scratch, with no money initially. We had to go raise all of this money and put together this system to do it. So it is possible to do it. We have to learn from this. We have to do better next time. But this is the largest and fastest rollout of vaccines that ever occurred in history. Now, we did note, as of January of during 2021, it was a terrible time. It was a terrible time because everybody wanted vaccines and everybody was behaving badly, and there were a lot of problems. By the end of 2021, we began to get the flow of vaccines we needed. By the way, the West stepped up and began to donate some vaccines to cover the ones that weren't coming. The manufacturers began to supply them. And so by the beginning of 2022, we had enough vaccines. The challenge was we still had coverage levels that weren't very good, mostly in Africa. And so we created a pushed effort to try to go ahead and move forward more aggressively. And at that time, there were 34 countries that had less than 10% coverage. Today, there are 6. 5 of the 6 are fragile countries, but we're continuing to work country by country to try to increase the amount of vaccines that's available. So what were the learnings from COVAX? So first of all, we did a network systematic approach. There's a lot of calls for let's create a new epidemic, agency or something. But what we did is we brought together CEPI, that was the agency that met originally with us, WHO, UNICEF, manufacturers, others. And the nice thing about a networked version is you can bring people in and out as they're necessary. We really need contingent financing. I ultimately raised $12.5 billion to do this in a relatively short period of time. But had I had a couple of $1 billion available on day one, I might have gotten into the queues earlier. Maybe it wouldn't have totally solved the problem, but I could have done some more technical assistance. So having contingent financing is available. Having surge capacity. Our overhead rate at Gavi is 2.47%. Donors love it, but that meant that people had to not only work double time, there was no excess capacity. We normally bundle delivery financing when we do vaccines. All those new vaccines I showed you, we didn't do it this time because everybody said, there's money, we're all going to do this together. We heard World Bank alone had $20 billion available. Turns out a lot of that money couldn't be used, so we had to go back out and ask for money for delivery, so I would bundle that again. The critical thing is the ability to take risks. We had the largest portfolio of vaccines in the world, 11 vaccines, and we began purchasing those before we knew if any of them worked. This is a risky thing for a public institution to do, but we got permission to do it, and if you can't take risks in a pandemic, you shouldn't be playing there. And finally, one lesson is you can't have vaccine manufacturing in every location. I saw the question we had yesterday at our table was, should we have vaccine manufacturing everywhere? Turns out it's not possible to do given the cost of the scale of production, et cetera, unless we have new technologies to do that, and science is working on. But what we want to do is make sure there's more diversification of manufacturing, particularly in Africa. And why do I say particularly Africa? Africa has 0.1% of the vaccine production and obviously has a large percentage of the world's population. Not on this map is, there were a number of producers in South America, but we didn't buy from them. But if you see our distribution metric for COVAX, there really was a lacunae in Africa, and this is something we're working on solving. So let me just finish with where the world's going. I would posit to you that we are now entering an era of polyepidemics. And if you look at the climate change we've been talking about, vector-borne diseases you've heard, the natural disasters that are going on, war and conflict, displacement and migration, the intense urbanization. We're now urbanized in a way that has never before been seen in history. A lot of this is leading to things like antimicrobial resistance, which vaccines are incredibly well set to deal with and we're already dealing with. So to me, this is the world we're living in. And so we have to take the systems we have, which work pretty well, we got to make them better, we got to make them more resilient, and we have to make sure we can react quickly when these things happen. Thank you for your attention.
Lots and lots of questions coming online. And I guess one of the really big ones is about vaccine hesitancy, because we've seen the rise and rise of vaccine hesitancy. And to see a country like the US have really low levels of coverage relative to some other countries that didn't have access to vaccines at the beginning is really disturbing. And through social media, it's spreading.
It is a very good question and a very important one. There's been vaccine hesitancy throughout history. One of my favorites is when smallpox vaccines were introduced, and you know they were made in, it was from cowpox. They had people with cows' horns growing out of their heads in a woodcut from the time. So always been there, but relatively easy to deal with. And the dirty secret is vaccine hesitancy mostly is a problem for wealthy countries. Yes. It's mostly in the countries where they don't see the diseases anymore. And then you see a parent saying, you know, I don't know if this is important, and I'm organic, and I want to take care of my children, and I don't want them to cry and hurt, and I don't know what's in the vaccine. That's where it comes from in general. There's have been in the developing countries vaccine hesitancy, but what changed for this pandemic was the politicization of vaccines, which we've never seen before in history. This was not about science anymore. I mean, the fact that you can ask that question in the US and look at that by political, party engagement is an incredible thing. And with today's social media, misinformation spreads at the speed of light, and it's much harder to reverse that spread. And there was also, by the way, nefarious bots that were producing information, both pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine, to try to reduce confidence in democratic institutions. So this is a problem. It's spreading to other vaccines, and we need to return to a trust in science and a trust in data, because without it, we are lost, particularly in a pandemic. One last point. In the pandemic, the truth is science is going to change. And this is hard because we don't explain that. We want to be definitive. But the truth is you know at this moment this, and then you learn something else, and it changes slightly and changes. We got to do a better job of saying it's still science, it's still the best data, but more data comes in and we learn more.
Yeah, we have to be out there and say uncertainty. It's really important. And also that vaccines, I think sometimes we say that vaccines are absolutely safe, and actually they're not absolutely safe.
They're a lot better than the natural disease. That's what we have to teach people.
That's the better way to frame the argument. Questions here in the audience. Otherwise, I have a ton of questions that have come in online. And Marcel from Slovenia, could we have a glimpse of what to expect from Gavi 6.0? Which vaccines are going to be included in the portfolio?
Wow. Somebody obviously is following closely. We divide our periods into 1.2, 2.0, et cetera, and we're right now starting the process of looking at Gavi 6.0. The way we do this is we have every 5 years a vaccine investment strategy where we get world science community to say, what's going to possibly be a vaccine in the next period? And it used to be easy because it took 10 years to make vaccines, so you kind of knew everything that was potentially going to come. Today, it's changing a little bit. And so that process is underway right now. We're at the stage where our board is going to look at a long list and is going to hopefully agree to shorten that down to a small number of products. There's a lot of exciting products that are coming. We have potential for TB vaccines coming. There's still a lot of work on HIV. I'm not sure we'll have one, but that's moving forward. New malaria vaccines, RSV, a lot of vaccines. But that group says not just are they coming, but will they be cost effective? Will they be able to make a difference in these communities versus existing interventions? And that's how the decisions get taken. We do have a separate mechanism for epidemic vaccines now because of the fact that that can move quicker, and that allows us any time to go ahead and consider it. So that's where we are on that. So I can't give a definitive answer, but stay tuned.
And how have mRNA vaccines changed the field for you at Gavi?
Well, I mean, so far they haven't changed it at all, except for the fact that we had to put in ultra cold chain. But, until recently, mRNA vaccines was a one-trick pony. Of course, now we've shown efficacy against RSV. It didn't work so well about type B flu, but I suspect science will overcome that, and I think it will become an important tool. Nothing right now beats mRNA in speed, and for a pandemic, speed is obviously critical. But we really don't know, and we haven't done the studies, is that the best vaccine to use after you get it started, because some of the other vaccines might have longer duration of protection, certainly have better shelf life, certainly have better temperature handling capabilities. And unfortunately, the way it rolled out in this pandemic, it kind of became the West did mRNAs and everybody else wanted mRNAs, and we didn't do cross comparisons the way we should have. And so we're not where we should be in that knowledge to answer what's best going forward. But we'll see whether this technology will have benefit across all the other diseases, and of course then whether it will do what it needs to do vis-a-vis duration of protection and handling characteristics, et cetera.
Final question for you, a personal question for you, Seth, because you must have just worked 24/7 just for months and months and months, as well as all your team. But what was your big personal learning from the pandemic? Because we've all come out of the pandemic, haven't we, with really rethinking some of the things that perhaps we thought about originally.
Well, first of all, I work hard anyway, but this was the worst 3 years of my life. It was 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. My wife often would serve me breakfast, lunch, and dinner in front of the screen as I was talking to political leaders and doing things. So it was not a good period. I guess the lessons for me are really three. One, science can deliver and deliver really fast. And Camila in her opening talk talked about the scientific method. We need to also think about adjusting and changing some of our methods. Like, do we always need to do, randomized, controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials? And can we figure out how to accelerate, like we did in COVID? So science can move really quickly. It's great. There are 400 vaccines in development. I think we're going to see a renaissance of products coming out of that. The second thing is how really bad people can behave, because there were some political leaders that were great, there were some companies that were great, there were others who were awful. And it shocked me. There were times I would just shake my head and say, could this really be happening? That what's happening? And so I have to wait for the book to do that. But
but there'll be some people who are not on your Christmas card list anymore.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Well, that's one of the problems. But the third lesson, I think, is it's like Margaret Mead said. People say to me, "Would you do this again?" Given you were the piñata for vaccines for 3 years, everybody criticized you, everybody. And would you do it again? And I said, of course, because what's the counterfactual? I mean, we're at 55% coverage for the developing world. How many people would have died if we hadn't done this? There would have been very little, if no vaccines in those parts of the world. The estimate now is we saved 2.7 million lives in the first year of the work of COVAX. So I think this is what we have to do, but we also have to realize that, beating up the people trying to do the right thing is not necessarily always the best way to encourage more people to follow in their footsteps.
Ladies and gentlemen, the world is extraordinarily lucky to have Seth Berkley.